If you want to learn Ansible network automation, watch this. We're going to kick off our first task, which is going to be a test. This test is going to validate whether the VLANs are configured on the switch. Test fails. We can validate the results of this by running a show. This is going to display the configuration on that switch. As you can see, this switch only has those default VLANs, but not the VLANs that we had defined in YAML. So for our next task, we're going to configure those VLANs by running a configuration task. Configuration task passes. We're going to re-execute the test that is going to validate the configuration of those VLANs one more time. Test passes. We run our show one more time. This is going to display the configuration of the switch. And here are our VLANs. VLANs 10, 998, and 999. If you want to learn how to do all of this, stay tuned because I'm going to show you how to build this right now. Welcome to the DevNet Zone. My name is John, and the topic for today is managing VLANs with Ansible. This video is part 1 of an Ansible multi-part series where I will be showing you how to manage VLANs, interfaces, OSPF, ACLs, and device management with Ansible. I'm going to show you how to configure them, display the configuration, test configuration or status, and delete configuration. The blueprint for these series of videos will be the new Cisco CCNP automation certification. So if you're looking at the Cisco Learning Network and look for the AutoCore exam topics, the goal for this series of videos is to construct a network automation solution with Ansible to manage configurations such as VLANs, OSPF, asset management, interface settings, and ACLs. For this specific video, of course, we're only focusing on VLANs. If you want to install the software that I'm running on my VM, I'm using an Ubuntu 24.04 VM. These are the software dependencies that you need to install. Ubuntu should already come with Python 3. If you don't already have it installed, here are the commands you need to install that. And then this is the specific Ansible package versions that I'm running. Here's the Ansible core. I'm running 2.18.10, and then the Ansible community 11.10.0. Right? You can install these with pip. I definitely recommend installing with pip and not any other package manager. Because we're specifically focusing on cisco.ios, you're going to use the Ansible Galaxy collection to install cisco.ios modules and ansible.net common. You don't have to install cisco.nxos because we're not focusing on NXOS for this video. And for Ansible, I definitely recommend installing Ansible tag pilot.sh. When you run playbooks and you don't have this installed, you're going to get errors, SSH specific errors, and the playbook is going to try to fall back to Paramiko, and you might run into some SSH issues. So I definitely recommend installing Ansible pilot.sh by running this specific command. The lab for this specific video, I'm using the Cisco Modeling Labs free edition from Cisco. The free version does limit you to 5 nodes, but because we're testing automation, we don't need more than 4 or 5 nodes for this lab. So 4 nodes would be more than enough. So I have 2 routers, router 1, router 2, and 2 switches, switch 1 and switch 2. And if you're not familiar with to find the Ansible documentation, you can go to this page, Ansible Community Documentation, collections in Cisco namespace, cisco.ios, and here is going to show you all the cisco.ios modules that you can use in Ansible. And for this video, you can definitely click on this guy. It even tells you how to install it and the module how to use within your playbook. And then these are all the parameters that you can use within your playbooks, right? If you need examples of how to use these parameters, you can scroll all the way down, and here's actual examples of the specific module being used. So you can copy and paste this into your playbook as a task and kick it off, and this should work. The only issue with this is that with this module and these examples, they're statically assigning all of these values, and the issue with this is fine if every single device that you're executing against has the same configuration. But most of the time, we're going to have devices that have different there's going to be deviations in the configuration for each device. So I'm going to show you an example of how to run this statically, just the way you see it here. And then I'm going to show you an example of how you can use data modeling to dynamically assign these values, and they'll be host specific. Here, I'm using VS Code to develop all of my code, and this is the folder structure that I'm using. So I have an inventory folder, and this is where my group and host vars directories resides. A log directory. So there's one log file in here. Every time I execute a playbook, you're going to see everything that either errors or messages that are part of that playbook, you're going to see them reflect inside of that log file. Playbooks directory, this is where I'm going to stage all of my playbooks. And the roles directory. I definitely recommend staging everything like this. This is definitely the recommended way. You're essentially using like Ansible's default framework to organize your inventories, your variables, your playbooks. As you continue to develop code, your number of playbooks are going to increase. Your number of inventories are going to increase. If you have a staging, development, production environment, you want to be able to separate those to different inventories and then different variables files. So I'll run through this real quick. So this is my inventory file, right? So I have my two routers that you saw earlier in the lab, my two switches with groups, routers, and switch. And then router and switch fall under the iOS, and secrets, right? So iOS, that means anything that falls under the iOS group inherits these variables. Same thing, this is where I maintain all my passwords. It's just good practice. You don't want to save any of your secrets in plain text, so it's good to use Ansible Vault, encrypt your passwords, or encrypt a file with your password variables, and encrypts the entire file, and nothing is saved plain text. So I mentioned earlier, right, your host specific variables and using data modeling to define or declare what your configuration looks like, right? So this is switch 1 and switch 2. So for the VLANs section, I have the VLANs, right? And then under VLANs is a list of directories. That means this switch 1, has 3 VLANs, VLAN 10, 998, and 999. Switch 2 has VLAN 20, 998, 999. So you're seeing how switch 1 and switch 2 have two VLANs that are the same, but one of those VLANs is different, 10 and 20, all right? So when we execute those tasks that are dynamic and we execute against both of these switches at the same time, you're going to see how that configuration differs. Playbooks, right? This is the iOS VLAN role. I'm going to be targeting the switch group, so switch 1 and switch 2, calling my collection, and I'm calling the iOS VLAN role. I'll show you this here. If we go to the iOS VLAN role, we go to tasks, you're going to see that my main.yaml file is all it's doing is including or importing each of these, right? So we have the VLAN configure YAML file, and this specific file has all of my tasks that are specific to configuring VLANs. This one is specific to deleting VLANs. This one's specific to the Jinja portion. Same thing is configuring, but I'm using a Jinja template, which I'll explain later. VLAN underscore show this is going to display the configuration for my VLANs, and this is for the test. And you can see I have the test tags, show, conf, right? So I'm using, I like to separate these into their own file so they're contained for their own specific category, right? So VLAN configure are under the configuration file. And then I just import them into my main task file that I can call here, right? So it allows me to get very organized, and you can technically put all of the contents of all these files into main.yaml, but you're going to have a very, very big main.yaml file. It's going to be very cluttered. And sometimes you can kind of mess up with the logic. So it's very nice to like separate those tasks. So when you click into one of those files, you're working only specifically in that file. All right, so we're gonna start with the VLAN configure. And this is what I explained earlier, right? So this is the iOS VLANs module, and we're statically assigning a VLAN 10. The state, this just means that it's going to be just adding the configuration to it. If you look at the delete option, same thing. This is statically, but this has a variable, and I'll explain that in a second. If you add purged, this will actually delete the VLAN that you find here. All right, so I have VLAN 10, And then this is a variable, which I'll explain in a second. And I like to use the when condition. So when you use when, and so the way this is read is when switch, like the value string, switch in device type. So this is saying is, and this is a variable that I created. So device type is a variable, and this is a variable that I defined in each specific host file. So each host has their own file, device type variable, switch. So if you look at a router, you're gonna see device type router. That means even though I execute a playbook against my entire inventory, router 1 will still get skipped because it did not meet that condition, right? So that is a condition that I'm setting here. When switch in device type, then this task will execute, right? So it's a nice safety net when you have different devices in your network. You can add something like this and it'll skip those devices. And then here, the second task is running. So this is what I brought up earlier. So I'm using loop, which is going to iterate through the VLANs dictionary, and it has a list of dictionaries here. So you can see, I'll put this one split screen, right? So loop through VLANs, and then each key has a variable item dot name, item dot VLAN, item dot state, and it's going to iterate through each one until it completes the entire list of dictionaries. So by the time you finish the entire task, it'll configure all three VLANs on each device. As you can see, this one has VLAN 20. So because these are variables, switch 1 is only going to get these VLANs that are defined here, versus switch 2 is only going to see this VLAN. So you see how this is very dynamic. Now you can define what the configuration looks like in YAML, and then the task will just pull in the host specific variables and configure that device with the configuration defined for itself, right? So, and then I'll quickly run through the other ones. So if you want to delete a configuration, you can do the same thing, right? So like for the dynamic one, if you configure all the VLANs, you can also delete all the VLANs. All I did was change the state to purged, and it'll delete it. If I want to display the configuration, right, this is using iOS underscore command. Just run the command show VLAN, and it's going to be displayed by debug, right? So I'm passing the variable output std outlines, and then it'll display the configuration. And then I'll show you a way where like a lot of times it's okay to like develop tasks that will display configuration, but the problem with that is you still have to look at the configuration yourself, right? So like let's say you have 10 devices or like 20 devices, right? You don't want to manually look at the configuration for 20 devices. So what you can do is you can create a test that will define. So for example, here I'm using iOS underscore facts, and facts is going to gather information specific to the VLANs, right? So this specific resource is calling VLANs. It's going to pass all of the output for VLANs into this variable called output. And then I'm using the assert module that's built into Ansible. The benefit of this is that, let's say, like I said earlier, you have 20 devices. You don't want to look at the configuration and say, hey, are all these VLANs on that I have defined here that I want present on the switches currently? If they all pass, you don't have to look through all 20 devices for the configuration because your test passed, right? As long as you have a valid test, obviously make sure your test is valid and the results do make sense. But if it passes against all your devices, you don't have to look at them. You can trust your test, or it'll fail. So if it fails on a specific device, then you know, okay, well, I have to go look at that device specifically, right? And not all 20 of them, right? So we're actually gonna run through this right now. So, okay, now we're gonna kick off the playbook for VLANs, but specifically for the static task. So we're gonna kick this off. This is going to configure a VLAN 10 on our two switches. Cool. We can actually just, because we have two switches, we can run the show. So I'm going to show you how to display the configuration. So change the tag to show, and quickly it displays the configuration, right? I can see VLAN 10 is on both of these switches, right? Let's run our test. So our test is currently set up to reference our data model, right? Which each switch has um, three different VLANs, right? So we're gonna see a series of tests pass or fail. We're gonna kick off our test. All right. So because I just configured VLAN 10, it says switch one. This specific test passed, right? So for switch one, hey, VLAN 10 is here. For switch two, VLAN 20 is not there, right? As we saw, it's just VLAN 10 on both of them. 998, 998, 999, 999, they all failed, right? So far only one test passed because switch one is the only switch that actually wants VLAN 10 in there, right? So that's a quick test. We're actually going to delete VLAN 10. So uh, this is for the task. So this one, so specifically, this is the static delete because I only want to delete the one, right? So all it's doing is expecting VLAN underscore del. In my command structure, as you can see here, right, I'm pretty much saying, hey, execute tags, delete static, and I'm passing. So tag E, you can pass a variable with your playbook as saying VLAN underscore del 10. So this one I can specifically define, hey, I just want to delete VLAN 10 on both of those switches. And then if I run my show, I'll see VLAN 10 is gone, right? So that's a way I can quickly just remove whether it's like a single VLAN or something, a specific variable that I want to pass in a playbook uh, in a quick manner. I'll run my test when I can. You'll see that the test will all fail because VLAN 10 was removed, right? So this one failed again. VLAN 10 is not there, right? So now we're done with the static configuration and deletion, right? So it's okay, right? But we want it to be dynamic. So now we're going to call the dynamic configuration, which is going to iterate through our actual data model, right? So you're going to see 10, 999 on switch 1, and you're going to see VLAN 20, 998, 999 on switch 2, right? We're going to run that right now. So conf, we want underscore D for dynamic. We're going to see our VLANs get configured, see how it's iterating through each one. And you can see from the display, you can see that these got configured. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm running my test. I'm not gonna run the show, I'm run the test, see what happens. All my tests passed, right? So I can see that 20 is on switch 2, 10 is on switch 1, all the other VLANs are where they're supposed to be. And just to validate the results of our test, make sure our test is actually working properly, we can run our show and actually display the configuration. Well, look at that, right? So switch 1, we have our 3 VLANs that we have defined in our data model, 10, 998, 999. And then for switch 2, we have VLAN 20, 998, and 999, which is specifically what we want. If we want to delete everything in bulk, let's say we want to delete everything we defined in our data model, we can run the underscore D, which is our dynamic. Says this is the inverse of our configuration. Pretty much saying, hey, everything in our data model we want to destroy, right? So it's gonna go through all 3 of them and delete them. We can run our test, and you should see all of our tests fail. Pretty much saying, hey, is everything in our data model within here? And they all failed, right? So this is a quick way where you can use data modeling to dynamically either configure everything you define in YAML, or you can delete everything you define in YAML, right? The next thing I'm gonna cover is using Jinja templates to configure devices. I would say for VLAN specifically, you probably don't need to go as far as using Jinja. Because it's a very basic configuration. It's probably like 2 lines. Um, but sometimes you might want to use one specific method. So if you're gonna use Jinja templates, you might prefer using Jinja templates for absolutely everything. Which is something I like to do. If I go do Jinja templates one thing, I just do it with everything else. So here I'll show you what the template looks like. There's a specific templates folder within this role as well, right? So Jinja is kind of like coding in a way, but you're defining what you want your configuration to look like. So just like I showed you earlier, I'll bring this over split screen, right? So this is using the exact same thing, right? So this is why I'm a fan of data modeling, because you use data modeling for pretty much everything, right? So same thing. This is iterating through VLANs. So for item in VLANs, VLAN item dot VLAN, so it's calling VLAN 10, and then name item dot name, which is HR. And then this is a for loop. So the same thing is going to iterate through all three of these until it's done. And then it's going to end the for loop. So this is what the syntax looks like in Jinja. And then you can actually render what this looks like. So if you want to test, I definitely recommend testing your Jinja template before you execute it on any device to see what the configuration actually looks like in real time. So I have a task here that's called render underscore Jinja. So if I execute in my playbook the render tag, it's going to look for role path, right? So essentially the iOS underscore VLAN, config directory, which config directory is my files, right? So here are my files after they're rendered, and then which default is files. Um, you so config directory, you can have a variables directory and file within that role too. So you see config directory is also files, but for some reason, let's say it doesn't find the config directory, I also set a default so I don't run into any weird errors. Um, so that's what it's doing here. And then it's setting the permissions and it's making sure that the files directory is also present. And then it's going to generate the config. So what it's doing here is saying, hey, look for the templates folder within my role, so templates, and then VLAN.j2, right? And then same thing, when it renders it, it's gonna go to the same path, role path, config directory, and it's going to use the inventory hostname variable, right? So as it's iterating through our switch 1 and switch 2, this variable is going to change, right? So it's gonna name the file switch1 or switch2.config like you're seeing here. I'll actually delete these real quick and I'll run the render because we want to see what our configuration looks like. So I went through switch 1 and switch 2. You can see real quick, it created those files and here's what it looks like, right? So I'll put a split screen. So here is our Jinja template, VLAN name. So you see it's the same structure. It's just because there's 3 iterations, it did it 3 times. So VLAN 10 name HR. And so when this gets pushed to your device via configuration, this is what it's going to look like after it iterated this. So this is obviously switch 1. You see it has VLAN 10 998 and switch 2 VLAN 20 name sales. So you're seeing how this is very dynamic. So now you have dynamic configuration generation and it's host specific. So this is just going to generate specific on what you defined in your data model, right? So it's very important that you create a YAML file for each device to make sure you keep track of those deviations in the configuration, right? Obviously, in this environment, we have only 4 routers, but like maybe at work or in some production environment that you're working at, you might have 50 devices, right? 50. You don't want to configure that manually, and you want to be able to define what each configuration looks like and dynamically. So once you build this entire Ansible framework, you will be able to configure 50 plus devices in less than 10 minutes, especially if you're deploying infrastructures, if you're doing big projects where you're deploying infrastructures or data centers or campuses. You can define all of this, test it in a virtual environment. Everything looks great. Once you spin up all of your out-of-band network connectivity, whatever project you're working on, you can kick this off and configure everything very, very quickly. Configure VLAN Jinja, which is the same thing as pushing iOS config using this specific module, templates VLAN.j2. As you can see, it's calling specifically the Jinja file and not the config file, right? Because this is being rendered at runtime. So when I kick it off, it's all happening. It's all happening live, right? But it's nice to use the rendering module to validate that what you're pushing is actually correct. Right. So conf underscore j, and push the configuration. This is so we're actually going to kick off our test. So we apply the configuration, kick off our test, and it's all green. Yeah, we don't even need to look at the configuration because our test is pretty much, we validated that the results are valid, and it came up green. So yeah, this wraps up the video on VLANs. This is part one of the Ansible multi-part series. If you want to learn how to do this for interfaces, OSPF, ACLs, you can definitely check it out on the multiple videos that are coming out after this, part two, part three, part four, that are coming up next. Thank you and stay tuned.